right. So,
Little guy's here.
oh, hey, buddy. He's
Man,
like,
you have been a busy guy in the last couple months, haven't you?
well, yeah, I mean, it's just been densely packed, over the past 2 months, 6 weeks. I mean, it's really just been a crazy fall. So, as I was saying, I use Google Earth a lot in my work. So I was looking earlier this morning at where all of you are, to try to get a sense in a digital way, I guess. There you are. You know where you are. um, but I use this tool, as many of you, to go visit places, to look at things that you can't necessarily afford to or want to use resources to get to. This is where I am. I'm in Tennessee, in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. This image is from one of my favorite vistas in the Smoky Mountains. This is overlooking the Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. This is actually from a high point at the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. And this is a Great Smoky Mountains National Park, so it's a preserved park and managed land in that regard. And this is a typical image of mountaintop removal and the devastation that is caused by strip mining for coal in Appalachia. I've included a few images from photographers that I've been in dialogue and conversation with over the years. In many cases, these photographers and environmental activists are able to get closer. I've been to many active mining sites, but I'm not a great photographer. So some of these images are quite stunning and dramatic. But I also wanted to sort of illustrate to you what's actually happening on the ground. And I'll kind of jump back and forth between some of these images and some of my own work as it responds to landscape. Does that make sense?
Is this open cut mining?
This is mountaintop mine. This is West Virginia.
Yeah.
And you can see, and I'll show you a few more of these images. Basically, a lot of the mountain, like a couple thousand feet, is removed in order to get to the coal seams. So, again, aerial photography becomes a critical piece of this in terms of understanding what's happening, because even when you go to these places in person, you don't get a sense of the dramatic destruction that's happening. A lot of the work that I make and that I do in collaboration with other artists like Elizabeth, my partner, this is a project that we did in Charlottesville, Virginia, about 10 years ago when we started working with these issues of mining. And at that time, some things happened in my backyard, quite literally, involving the coal industry and human-made disaster, which I'll talk about in detail in a few minutes, that sparked the work that I'm doing now and have continued to do for the last 10 years. At this time, I was still trying to sort of get a sense of how to even grapple with these massive issues. And I was going back and forth between doing field studies and photography on mining sites, and then coming back to the studio and using the tools and the materials that I was familiar with in trying to chart, map, and explore these ideas of the impact of landscape by the extraction industries. It was a long learning process, and I learned a lot, continued to learn a lot about mining, oil and gas, extraction, fracking, and so forth. Those are all very heavy topics. So I also like try to blend with my work some kind of poetry and reflection. And so this piece was really just an elegy or a memorial to mountains which have been lost. And those numbers continue to go up, sadly, but we're roughly at least 500 mountains in Appalachia that have been forever altered and destroyed in our efforts to extract the coal to power things like my technology that I'm using here and the lights in this room. So there it is, beautiful clean coal. This is a detailed image of a chunk of that gold that we are so prized. I will use this, and you will see later in my presentation how I'm using it to actually digitally abstract or extract information from topography in order to actually shape the forms and the sculptures that I'm making. This is a particular site that I've been studying in Kentucky, and again, the aerial photography I think allows you to see, as you can see at the lower right image, the natural forest or what was left of it, and then how the bulldozers and the dynamite, reshaped the land. I was saying to John when we were getting ready to do this presentation that oftentimes I start in sort of a newest work, and I thought it might be because I have the show that I just had in Tallahassee, a solo exhibition, which really allowed me to put a lot of sculpture and artwork into one space that I had created over several years. So I thought I'd start with some newer work, or at least some newer images, and then kind of jump back to some of the origins of where these came from. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay. So I'll show you details of all of these sculptures as we go through a few more images, but this is from the show that I just installed in Tallahassee. I just called it Mining the Landscape, which is also the title of my talk, and it's kind of just this phrase that I use often in my work. And you can see here, and I'm sort of approaching the idea of imposing geometry on landscape and sort of zooming in and zooming out to get micro and macro views. I'm also trying to work with materials which are both borrowing from the industry and combining what I work with in the studio. These images from some years ago were derived directly from those photographs that I was taking when I started visiting active mining sites. At this point, I was still really new to this topic, and I was really trying to just see in person the subject that I was trying to investigate. I like to work with collage a lot. John knows from all of our years of sharing artwork and ideas. And so these are about 5 feet long. They're quite large. Just images that I've cut up and reassembled, as happens with the landscape in the extraction process. And then just taking the tools that I know, like a pickaxe, and juxtaposing it with the drag line, which is this massive, huge piece of equipment for dredging and dragging earth materials. Again, going back to the exhibition in Tallahassee, you can see here on the right from a series of sculptures that are initially, actually the wireframe for this piece on the right, I salvaged it from that earlier work that you saw with the black fabric, which was stretched over these frames, and they were sitting on the floor. And then I often will recycle materials and forms and make new artwork out of them. So with this one, I was trying to explore this idea of deep mining, digging into the earth, going underground, and this idea that we have of how we locate ourselves. We're just above ground. We're walking on we're looking at things based on our horizon line, our relationship to earth and sky. We don't tend to think about what's below our feet. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to imagine in my work as an artist and sculptor. These are newer works. On the left is a cast iron piece. And this is the form of this is derived from a copper mine in New Mexico. And again, I was working with a specific map and recreating that topography and the terraced layers that happen when humans are trying to get down deep into the earth to extract valuable materials. And then on the right is a piece called Hazard, and that is derived from a specific place, Hazard, Kentucky. I was looking at Google Earth Maps and using that data to import into SketchUp and CAD software, which then I use to abstract and ultimately flatten the landscape to use digital fabrication. I'll show you some studio shots from the shop a little later so you can see sort of how these are actually built and assembled. But that's steel. It's roughly 5 feet by 4 feet. And then I've got coal from Kentucky, from very close to where this actual site that I'm looking at, and I've inserted that into the center. The map is a specific county, Perry County in Kentucky, where Hazard is located. I also like this kind of wordplay that can happen with everything, but in particular, that's how I sort of generate titles. So Hazard, obviously, the hazards that we face in this world, accelerating climate change, but also the name of the place, Hazard, Kentucky. This is, again, going back to West Virginia. You get sort of a different perspective, so now zooming out a bit. And then this newer work, again, going back to the digital fabrication, and this was working from another site in eastern Kentucky, about 3 hours. And with this new work, which is called Circuit, this is actually in a group exhibition right now called Systems of Value. The curator was interested in, what's that? Go on. Are you, I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry, I can't hear the question.
Can you hear me better now?
That is really clear. Yes, I can hear you.
There's a speaker in it. Okay, so you were saying that you were working from eastern Kentucky and then you cut out for a moment.
Oh, okay, yeah. I guess that speaker will also be your microphone. So, so eastern Kentucky, the steel form in this sculpture is taken directly from a map. Well, it's a small section of a place near Hazard, Kentucky. And I've abstracted the landscape and sort of reinterpreted it. But I'm also trying to juxtapose sort of these industrial rigging and structural forms with this floating landscape. I'm also, with this piece, the first sculpture that I've used lighting, electrical elements in some time. So that's sort of a new direction that I'm exploring, is trying to draw a more connection between our use and consumption of electricity and the raw materials that power that. Did you hear all of that? Great. This is a photograph. Sorry, it's a bit pixelated. The actual black and white print is much more rich, like an Ansel Adams. But this is from a friend of mine, Richard Stevens, who's a photographer, artist, activist in West Virginia. Richard really sort of gave me my education on the ground, driving me around the mountains of West Virginia, in Cayford County and near Whitesburg, West Virginia, on an ATV many years ago, showing me what was happening. Richard is also a map maker, and really his photography has shifted into environmental activism, working with to try to gather information that they can use in lawsuits against mining companies and so forth. But this terrace that you can see here is something called a valley fill. And just backing up to this image, where the way in which I put the coal, quite literally dumping or pouring that coal into that valley, is something that the industry routinely, it's a routine practice, the coal. And so they will mine the coal, and then the waste that's produced from that, which is like a sludge, toxic sludge from washing the coal, they'll pump it back up to the top of the mountain and pour it into valleys. So essentially ruining watersheds, filling valleys that with the waste from the mountain that was destroyed. Basically throughout Appalachia, there are these looming pits of sludge at high altitudes. Again, this is going back to the earlier work that I was doing, and some more images of the equipment as it carves up the landscape. I often talk about this kind of practice as a destructive, dystopian kind of earthwork. If you're familiar with the history of land art and sculpture, going back to the 1970s, especially in the US, there's a precedent for working in the landscape, directly altering the terrain, and that idea of like an earthwork that is really sort of twisted. Again, some of the collaborations that I've done over the years have been quite productive in helping me better understand. I like the dialogue of working with other artists, but have these conversations, which I think are so critical to our environmental dialogue in general. This piece you saw earlier inside the gallery in Tallahassee, but it really is designed to live outdoors. And the idea of this from the inception, Elizabeth and I created this together along a series of other outdoor sculptures that were intended to mark or demarcate just landscapes which had been devastated by industry. So we created this in a residency on the coast of Oregon called the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology, which is a fantastic preserved wilderness, but also, sorry, I couldn't hear that.
We're losing you.
You cut out.
Okay.
Go back to the bit where you said about the Center of Art and Ecology, please.
Okay. So this was, my partner and I did a residency at the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology on the coast of Oregon, right along the Pacific Ocean. Quite a beautiful place. But beyond the wilderness, around the residency center, there's a lot of clear-cut logging, which is typical of the West. And this piece was created in response to that but we also have continued to install this sculpture on other landscapes which have environmental damage. This is another project that we did on the dunes, and a lot of dune buggies eroding the landscape there, and so we created these like grass-like forms with flashing lights. And this is a project that we did with local high school students. We used 7,000 survey flags to chart what had been the natural meander of a creek, which was critical for salmon. The fish needed natural meandering creeks to spawn on their journey from the Pacific Ocean. And this creek had been diverted for agricultural purposes, and now it actually, I'm happy to say, has been restored. So not that we had a direct impact on that. This was really, we were just part of a 10-year project of artists and hydrologists, biologists, fisheries working together to repair this landscape. This was just a way to visualize that. And I think a lot of the work that I do as an artist is really about that. It's about using aesthetics to frame the discussion and using aesthetics to imagine and visualize a different kind of landscape. So going back to close to where I live, this is the primary power plant that's generating the lights here in this room. This is primarily coal-fired, which still constitutes about 50% of our electrical dependence in the US. On the left is an image, I mentioned earlier coal ash or coal slurry, and these are in containment ponds throughout Appalachia. Some of them are high up in the mountains. Some of them are right alongside rivers. Most all of them are simply contained through engineering and earthen dams. And after heavy rains, sometimes those fail. And that happened about a little over 10 years ago in 2008. And this is the event for me that really propelled me into action as an artist to devote my artwork and art practice entirely to environmental issues. So you can see on the left the contained and the river, the Emery and the Clinch River, and then the day after this disaster happened, how all of that coal slurry and toxic sludge broke free of the dam that was holding it and moved out into the rivers. And these are some images that were taken at that time of the sludge spilling out, taking over the river. We're still dealing with this 10 years later. The ecological damage, the toxic pollution, even though the power company says it cleaned everything up, it's remediated the site, people are still getting sick. Workers who were cleaning it up are dying of cancer. And fish have abnormalities, and amphibians in this river. So this work was the first sculptural response that I created to that disaster. And I was just trying to work with this idea of structures, like specifically this house, this 100-year-old farmhouse, that's ruined and then upended, really. And I work with this idea of like turning things upside down or inverting structures often in order to think about our impact. So this is a later sculpture. This is about 6 feet long, and I'm just working with standard construction materials. But you can see the sort of suburban horizon line or suburban cityscape there on the top edge, and then the mountain shape that's been inverted or flipped upside down. And this whole thing is sort of a rocking seesaw. And I like this idea of balance, that it's precarious and our relationship to the environment is quite precarious. In that the piece on the left is called Overburden, and this is really referencing the way in which thousands of pounds of rock are dynamited off of mountaintops to get at the coal seam, and then the watershed system is effectively ruined. And so that idea, I hope, metaphorically and symbolically comes through in these materials. And the piece on the right is called Seam. Again, thinking about coal seams, reclamation, which is a key topic that I'm now trying to work with. So coal companies, after they finish mining, they're supposed to reclaim and restore the land, and that rarely happens, or it's quite inadequate. So oftentimes they'll simply bulldoze an approximation of what the original contour or ridgeline looked like, and then they'll simply plant non-native grass seeds, which you can see here. So the hardwood forests don't come back, and you basically end up with a savanna landscape on top of a mountain. This is from another series working with ideas of mountain culture. This is the title of this piece is Big Rock Candy Mountain. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that song. It's an old Appalachian Americana tune. But this whole plastic rock is filled with a rock candy, and so I was trying to take a little break from sort of the heavy destruction and get a little bit more into the exploratory, but also talking more about mountain culture, not just the actual land materials. I'm going to move forward to this. Okay. This is from a project I did in Lexington, Kentucky. And you can see some elements that I've recycled for some of those newer pieces. This was a large installation I did in an old powerhouse that was at a distillery. Hey, John. If you guys can't hear something, just please interject, okay? Because I don't know if all of this is coming through, but okay. So the title of this piece is Lost Mountain. And again, going back to a specific geography and place, in eastern Kentucky, there is a place called Lost Mountain, and it was named Lost Mountain before it was mined. But then the mountain was actually lost about 10 years ago through the process of coal mining. So I was trying to draw parallels and connections between the consumption of power in the community of Lexington and eastern Kentucky, just about 100 miles from Lexington. I also have been trying to do more work outdoors. So this piece was cast iron on the left. The counterweight is a copy of the plastic rock on the right, which is a typical landscaping fake rock that's used to conceal utilities in people's yards. And I was trying to work with ideas of how petroleum products end up finding their way into so much of our world, including fake rocks. The title Tipple comes from the mining industry also. The piece on the left is more inspired by where I grew up in Minnesota. In that helmet is taconite, which is a low-grade iron ore, and that is still actively mined in northern Minnesota in open pit mines. I'm trying to keep on track of the time here as well, so I have to limit my storytelling. Just moving forward through these images. Piece on the right triangulation and excavation isn't about any place in particular. It's more about the idea of how we survey landscapes and to them. Triangles have formed that, and the stone at the base of this is marble, which is mined in Colorado. And so you see this piece popping up in different group shows. One thing about the piece is you can see the mirrored element on the underside. So I like this idea. I've been working with mirrored plastic and mirrors a bit in the past few years so that people can see their reflection, hopefully, in the landscape, but also have that reflective experience of thinking about how we are in relationship to particular places. So here, this piece, Double Mountain. This is about 7 feet long. The show that I had in station for Instagram, which was okay. It was good to have a bit of fun. But I guess it's also really just, I hope, a mirror in which we sort of pause and in a more serious way. This is a project in Kentucky called Overpowered. I'm going to visit this next week. I'm looking forward to seeing how the inverted pylon, the tower, is starting to degrade because it's rusting down over stone. This is at Josephine Sculpture Park. And then just looking a little bit more from the studio at the tools that I'm currently using. So you can see here some of the modeling software that I'm working with. And that image on the upper left is one of those valley fills. That gets translated into the shop. Use digital fabrication methods, including water jet cutting, to basically create like an origami kind of version of the landscape. And there's something that I've acutely aware of and I'm constantly sort of struggling with is the cost of the materials, the environmental cost of the materials that I'm using. So not only is the steel obviously produced by industry from mining, but this process of water jet cutting is actually quite not environmentally friendly. So I'm a bit torn there because the garnet that is used to blast and cut the metal is a mined product and currently is not very easily reclaimed. This is from my residency at the Banff Centre in Canada. This is called Front Range. And the show that I'm working on for Jacksonville, Florida, will have a lot more sculptures working with this idea of building construction materials that we use in our homes and juxtaposing those truss forms with peaks and valleys, mountains and valleys. This is another piece called Erratic that came from that same series. And this piece I built in foam core in Banff, in my studio there. I could talk more about that for an hour, but that place is amazing. If you ever get a chance to apply to that residency, I would highly recommend it. This is a large, basically my direct interpretation of some of the Rocky Mountains, Canadian Rockies, that I was surrounded by there. But the piece scanned it. I could not bring it back home. So we scanned it with a digital handheld scanner. And now I'm rebuilding the piece through 3D printing and digital fabrication in my shop here. That is the end of those images.
Sorry, what was the name of that residency in Canada?
It's the Banff Centre.
Banff.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm going to show you a few websites real quick, and I can look at that one. It's in the it's in the national park. It's on and it's a long history of this amazing place where hundreds of artists and musicians, writers come together to exchange ideas, work together. It was a huge opportunity. It was a tremendous gift. I was there for a month last winter. So the work that John mentioned that I'm doing with this group, the Land Report Collective, is a group of artists, and it's been a very fruitful, productive dialogue. We've been working together for 4 years now, and we're doing not only exhibitions, but we're doing lectures, panel discussions, working with writers and scientists. Our big project that we've got coming up is this international project called Extraction, Art on the Edge of the Abyss. I would encourage all of you to check it out. They welcome other creative thinkers. Artists, scientists are working together for a series of exhibitions and programs in the year 2021. And this is really kind of an international effort to bring together art and science to address issues of climate change, specifically related to extraction and the mining industry. I'm just one small piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of people working really hard on this topic, and a lot of great art being made about it. So, what questions do you guys have?
Just speaking for myself, and having known you for as long as I have, I just have to say that it's a lot of information to take in and to invest and to think about. I mean, not just as a sculptor or as an artist, but as an activist. The one question that I had tonight was how as an artist we see ourselves, what sort of influence can we have on the transition from finite fuel and energy to more renewable energy. You really help with.
Yeah. Keep going.
I was just going to say, and so like that seems to be at the. I mean, we can talk about your inspiration as a sculptor and your sculptures and the work that you do, but really it seems to me that at the core of all this is the issue of where do we go from here relative to climate change, and how can we be effective in some way as an individual and as an artist in the community, right? Or
Yes. That's absolutely. Oh, and I appreciate you sending me that question earlier so I could think about it. I think that is the key question, and I don't know. I mean, personally, I don't know how much change I can actually affect. I'd love to try to use my art as a catalyst for conversation, as a way to network with other people from a range of different backgrounds and disciplines. So not just working with environmental activists, but talking to coal miners, talking to people who are from all different kinds of walks of life. But we're all in this together, and the time is obviously quite critical. As you all know from the climate strikes that have been happening around the world, the science is clear. And I personally feel, I know not every artist can make their art about this topic, or, I don't know that I'm entirely qualified to either, but it's just something I feel compelled to do. And there's so many great things happening all over the world. And it is, I think you're right, John, is that it's a visioning process. As I was saying earlier with that project that Elizabeth and I did many years ago at the Sitka Center, it was if all that if the primary change that we can affect as artists is to simply reimagine, right? Use the power of imagination and creativity. I mean, I think there's some great creative design solutions happening. I think conversations between artists and engineers to think outside of the box can have tremendous actual practical impact, and applied design has tremendous potential. But at this point, I think, like this art 350.org, you might be familiar with, has been around for a few years, organizing environmental issues around climate change. But just the way in which visual mediums, whether it's direct action in the streets, or whether it's installations, things that are being done like street paintings. I mean, all of that is important part of what we're doing. It makes it a lot more exciting. It catches people's attention, I hope, in the way that maybe we get overwhelmed with data and with the science, or we tend to ignore it. If it's just all like words on paper, it's not the same as images. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think it's used as a focus, which people would otherwise ignore, as you say. On paper, it's just there. We read about it, but we need to get see it and talk about it.
Right. I mean, visually, like, go ahead. Sorry, was that a question?
No, I was saying I think you can use your art as a way of focusing attention.
I hope so. I mean, photography has been doing this for a long time, and continues to be a primary medium. This organization, Appalachian Voices, that I'm involved with, video interviews with people who live in these affected communities. I just think it's so critical. Map making cartography is fantastic, but it's narrow in its scope, or it doesn't have to be narrow in its scope. And so I think visual artists, performance artists, musicians can come in and sort of mix up the narrative a bit. Because a lot of this, I think, is about storytelling and making the invisible visible.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. I think that was a lot. That was a lot to take in for me. Even have you for. Jason and I have known each other since 1992, so we've known each other for a long time, and I know his work. But do you have any other questions?
I haven't got a question, but I just want to say that was very interesting, and that I don't know an awful lot about the coal sludge and that kind of thing, and it's quite horrifying. And but it's I like the fact that your work makes you think, but it is also beautiful as well. And
I agree.
Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I hope that I could visit Australia in person. Oh, thanks.
Well, lots of coal rallies up here that you can join us in.
Yeah,
I
understand. Yeah. Well, again, thank you all for the time and for your interest. And I encourage you to get my contact information from John, or look online at my website. Feel free to contact me with any questions. Continue the conversation. It would be my pleasure.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Jason.
Bye.
Okay.
And it's going on 5 a.m. there.
That's right. Time to go get the kids ready. Yeah.
And he's got to go back home and take care of the kids and get everyone ready for school.
Well, have a great day.
Yeah, have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, and I'll be in touch with you later.
All right, John. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.